Crime is always a very hideous thing, but something about unsolved stories finally coming to light hits differently. The stories that I am going to share with you today are going to shock you in a way that you would have never imagined. Minnesota, a seemingly perfect town for anyone to live in, but every place has its dark secrets. In August 2003, something peculiar happened. Some skeletal remains were discovered on the Highway 5 in Bradford Township. The way the skeletal remains were found was eerie, as the landowner was excavating that area and was shocked to find these remains. He alerted the authorities, who later sent them to the forensics. They soon gave the details of the skeleton to find out more about who it belonged to. The forensic revealed that it was the body of a white male who was not more than 28 years old. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Minnesota also revealed that the body had been buried there for decades, and nobody until now had discovered it. The forensic team gathered all the evidence and started creating that man's DNA profile. They also analyzed his teeth to try and match it with a database of records to identify him. But no record was ever found. The investigators named the man the Asante County John Doe and made several attempts to reconstruct his face. Everybody wanted to know who this mysterious John Doe was, and who killed the man and buried him there years ago. Several years had passed, and many people came forward to give their DNA samples to help out in the investigation. John's mystery, however, still seemed to be stuck in a dead end. In 2019, the forensic department reopened the case with advanced technology under their belt. It was when Chief Deputy Lisa Lovering initiated the process of advanced DNA technology that of John was opened again, and his DNA was submitted to the lab. Unfortunately, the DNA was too old to be recognized. Later that year, Lisa heard of a Texas-based laboratory that used gray genome sequencing to build the profiles of skeletal remains. The laboratory name was Othram, and it was with their help when the forensics were able to develop a new viable DNA profile for John Doe. A new DNA profile was made, and this time was sent to a genetic genealogy consultant, Barbara Ray, for further investigations. In less than 24 hours, Barbara Ray, along with Deputy Chief Lisa Lovering, found a match of a distant relative. In no time, she had the information of 2 siblings of John and their phone numbers. Now the investigation officially started, and the siblings were contacted. It was revealed that their brother Donald Rindle of Ramsey County, Minnesota, had been missing since 1970. The siblings told the investigators that the FBI had been looking for Donald, but did not have any luck. Later in 2022, the DNA of all the siblings were matched, and it was finally revealed that who had been missing for the last 51 years. It was believed that someone had taken his life, and he was buried at that site when he was 22. Investigators also believe that people who might be involved in his murder or know the whole story might be alive to this day, but nothing is confirmed. This was a very emotional moment for the family, as they were able to find closure about Donald's disappearance after 51 long years. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. In 1994, a 39-year-old woman named Cheryl Huss lived in Desert Hot Springs, California. She had recently gotten divorced from her husband Jeff Huss, who lived in Cathedral City, California. After their divorce, Cherry moved to the Hot Springs to start a new life. They both had 3 children, and they shared the custody of the 3. One of them was 14, the other 13, and the little one was only 8 years old. After 2 months of separation from her husband, Cheryl was excited to start fresh in her new apartment. But the unimaginable was about to happen. On April 23, 1994, Cheryl called her parents to tell them that someone had been taking photos of her, and she had been receiving anonymous phone calls from someone. She sounded terrified, and so her parents decided to check on her. On April 23rd, they left their house to go to Hot Springs, California. When they reached Cheryl's apartment, things did not feel normal. The porch light was on. Her dog was out, and her car was parked on the street instead of the driveway. The parents went inside and found a horrendous scene. Cheryl's body was lying partially naked on the floor. She had been ****ing a lot of times. There was also a bite mark on her neck by her potential murderer. The parents called 911 and the investigations immediately started. The police took the saliva samples from the bite on Cheryl's neck and created a DNA profile of the murderer. They tried to match it with several other DNA profiles in their database, but found no match. Years had passed and Cheryl's parents tried their best to keep the case alive. They even offered a price of $50,000 for anyone who might identify the murderer. In 2022, with the help of the latest genetic technology, the DNA was identified, and to everyone's surprise, a match was found. The DNA belonged to a male who lived 12 miles away from Cheryl's home and was now 48 years old. Charon Eugene Gatton was the person of interest. He was just 20 years old when he murdered Cheryl. On February 14th, they received a saliva sample from Sharon, and on the 18th, it was confirmed that he was the murderer. On March 4, 2022, he was arrested, and it was found out that he had been arrested for trespassing, intoxication, and had gotten many DUIs in 1994, but was still roaming around free until his recent arrest. It was still unclear to why he murdered Cheryl, or what the main motive behind his barbaric doing was. But after several years of being in the dark, Cheryl's finally got her justice. On June 5, 1986, in Eugene, Oregon, the police and the fire department were called to an apartment as they believed that a person had died. An apartment employee stated that he had not seen 62-year-old Gladys May Hensley for several days and was concerned about her. Unfortunately, the day when the police arrived, he had found Gladys murdered in her apartment. The investigation started, but there was no sign of forced entry into the apartment, nor were there any suspects. The police believed that Gladys was killed in the early hours of June 4th. This case was still going on when on June 19, 1986, the body of a 33-year-old woman on Coburg Road. She was found naked and was lying upside down on her face. The police quickly linked Janice's murder to Gladys, as they had both been found in the same area and were also murdered in the same way. There were no further clues, unfortunately, and the case went cold until 2 years later in 1988, when a 73-year-old Geraldine Toohey was on the phone with her sister when her call suddenly dropped. A small power cut or that somebody else had called her, so she did not worry that much. The next day when she dropped by her house, she found a horrible scene. Geraldine was lying naked on the floor and was brutally murdered. The investigators knew that this case was also linked to Genesis and Gladys' murder, as it was done in a similar manner. The murderer had broken in through the front door and had cut the phone lines so that nobody seen. Unfortunately, due to no evidence, this case also grew cold. Many years later, the police took the help of the genetic genealogy department to identify the murderers of this case. This time it was successful and a suspect was found. It was a man named John Charles Balsinger. He was born on September 17, 1957, but unfortunately, the case once again hit a dead end, as he had ended his life on March 23, 1988, in Springfield, Oregon. When John's history was looked into, it was revealed that he had been taken into custody for murder in 1980 in the city of Utah, and was sentenced to only 5 years of imprisonment. After serving for only a short amount of time, he got out and was subsequently linked to the murder of those 3 women, Janice, Gladys, and Geraldine. The case was finally solved, but before the murderer could be caught, he was already dead. These cases are beyond awful and are also very unfortunate because it took years to finally find the culprits. Had it been a little earlier, the culprits could have been caught and brought to justice. The stories that I am going to share with you today took so many years to get resolved that the conclusion of them might seem bittersweet. The families of the victims had given up on ever getting justice, but technological advancements paved the way for them. It was January 27, 1996, when a 17-year-old Gladys Orellano went missing from her home in Boyles Heights, Los Angeles, California. She was a young girl with tall ambitions. She was ready to conquer the world. Gladys' family reported her missing the same day she failed to return, and the investigations began their search for her. The hope was there that Gladys would be found until the unimaginable happened. 3 days later, on January 30th, a body was reported. It was Gladys' body, located 34 miles from downtown Los Angeles, tossed into a ravine in the remote area of Topanga. Her autopsy showed that she was assaulted and later murdered. Investigations began and DNA was collected off her body, after which a DNA profile was made. The investigators were quite confident that they would find a match rather quickly, but to their surprise and disappointment, there was no match. After several attempts on finding the culprit, there was no other evidence to work with, and the case went cold for over 25 years. Decades later, in November 2019, a man named Jose Luis Garcia was arrested for domestic assault. According to the laws in California, Garcia was required to submit his DNA sample. Little did the officers know that this unrelated crime would help them in solving a case that had long gone cold. The officer got a warrant to compare his DNA to the crime scene of Gladys back in 1996. Unfortunately, this took quite a while, and Garcia was released and had moved back to Dallas in the meantime. The Texas federal law enforcement didn't waste any time in arresting him and asked him questions about the incident that took place back in 1996. But he claimed that he had no idea about it even though his DNA proved to be a direct match. At the time of Gladys' murder, Garcia was only 1 year older than her. But the true motives of the murder have not been revealed as of yet. Garcia was not found guilty and is still awaiting a trial. He is currently being held on $1 million bail. After 25 years, a bit of sheer luck revealed Gladys' true murderer, but it may take more time for justice to finally be served. Our next case is similarly unfortunate, and it took even longer for it to be solved. Wendy Jerome, a 19-year-old teenager, was sexually assaulted, beaten, and then brutally killed in 1984. It was the 2nd of November 1984 in Rochester, New York, and everyone was busy with their Thanksgiving celebrations when this horrible incident took place. It was in the evening when Wendy left her house to deliver a birthday card to her best friend who lived in the same neighborhood. She was expected home by 8 p.m. that night, but she never returned. When she did not return, her family became frantic and called the authorities for help in looking for their daughter. A few hours later, it was reported that Wendy's body was found near a dumpster behind a school. She was sexually assaulted and later brutally murdered. The investigations began and the DNA samples were collected from Wendy's body in order to find the culprit. Unfortunately, forensic technology was not as advanced in the 1980s, and no matches were found for the next few decades. 36 years later, the investigations were reopened after Wendy's mother was adamant to provide her daughter with justice. The sample was taken back in 1984 and has stayed preserved since then. It was once again entered into the DNA database as used to find relatives. Only this time, a match was found. It was a 54-year-old male named Timothy Williams who lived in Melbourne, Florida. Timothy lived in Rochester in 1984 and shared the same neighborhood as Wendy Jerome. However, the two did not know each other. Timothy was extradited back to Rochester from Florida immediately and was asked multiple questions regarding this murder. At first, he refused to recall any association with Wendy, but the amount of evidence against him was far too much to ignore. The DNA of the semen found on Wendy's body was an exact match to Timothy's DNA. There was no room for escape. He was charged with second-degree murder, but was not charged with sexual assault, as those charges had been expired for over 10 years when Timothy was arrested. Almost 36 years later, Wendy Jerome got justice. While it was said that her father passed away before he could see the face of her murderer, her mother lived to see the day. She was reported saying, "I never thought I would see this day, and now it's here." Mrs. Jerome said, "I just wish my husband had been alive to see this. He passed away in 2011, and I know he's up there with her, smiling and saying it's over. It's finally over." It happened in Gold Coast, Australia. There was a beautiful young married woman who was just 21, but she didn't know that her happy journey would come to such an abrupt end. What it resulted in was a 37-year-old nightmare for her family. In today's video, we'll look at two such cold cases. Let us now look into the 37-year-old case that happened in Australia. It was one of Australia's most prolonged cold cases. Before it was revealed that the same murderer had murdered another lady 2 years later, the man accused of raping and murdering Gold Coast woman Linda Reed in one of the state's longest cold case killings pled guilty. In December 1983, Ms. Reed, 21, was last seen taking a lunch break from her retail job at Pacific Fair in Broadbeach. Her corpse was discovered in a thicket near Gavin. According to the court, the murderer tied her hands behind her back, raped her, took her into the jungle, and forced her head into a stream bed. Her official autopsy said that she died of drowning, smothering, strangling, or suffocation after inhaling dirt and debris into her lungs. The court was informed that 2 years after killing Vanessa O'Brien, 22, in Brisbane under identical circumstances. However, it was not until 2018 that O'Mara was prosecuted for Ms. Reed's death, making it one of the state's most prolonged cold cases. This day has been 37 years in the making for the Reed family, Crown Prosecutor Jody Wooldridge said. In addition to the court, Ms. Wooldridge delivered victim impact statements from Ms. Reed's widower, Robert Reed, and her mother Nancy Fain. Troy O'Mara was already serving a life sentence for the murder of Vanessa O'Brien in 2018, when he was charged with the murder of Reed after 35 years. O'Mara pled guilty to her rape and murder in almost no time. During the sentencing hearing, the court heard that O'Mara was 17. He approached Miss Reed in her car at random, threatened her, and forced her to drive to an isolated location. Justice Glenn Martin considered that O'Mara was a minor at the time of the crimes, and wondered whether he should be prosecuted as an adult when deciding O'Mara's punishment. He also thought about how much time O'Mara had spent in prison for his previous offenses. A strict mathematical formula could not establish the sentence, but another life sentence would be excessive, according to Justice Martin. If the defendant had committed the 2 murders as an adult in current times, minimum of 30 years in jail, he stated, a sentence of life imprisonment is not acceptable since the defendant would have to serve an additional 15 years in prison before being eligible for release. Considering these, only in July 2022, O'Mara will be able to petition for parole. The prosecution requested the judge to agree that on the day he murdered Ms. Reed, O'Mara was determined to go out and kill a lady at random, as he acknowledged to police after he murdered Ms. O'Brien. Justice Glenn Martin then responded by saying that he did not need such admission to determine his motivation. The nasty purpose he harbored at the time is sufficient to illustrate how he abused her in the short time before her horrific death. He added, but he stated it did not reflect regret. The petition does show some cooperation. The request comes after a long period of denial. He said, modern forensic techniques to re-examine 150 exhibits and re-interview more than 100 witnesses. Witnesses' cooperation and patience with Queensland Police and Linda Reed's family and friends have been critical in ensuring Linda's justice, she said. Detective Senior Sergeant Kentwell applauded the detectives, who never gave up outside of court. I'd like to thank many members of the Queensland Police Service for their hard work over the years, she added. Robert Reed, Ms. Reed's widower, broke down in tears as he praised the police, prosecutors, and the community for sticking by them. I'd also want to express my gratitude to the witnesses who came forward, he said, and the media for putting it out there, letting people know what's going on. Let us now look at how Lee Rotatory's murder was finally resolved in 1982 without any arrests and warrants. Authorities were summoned to the Best Western Frontier Motor Lodge in Council Bluffs, Iowa, on the afternoon of June 25, 1982, after receiving allegations of a suspicious death. According to Iowa Cold Cases, a hotel employee discovered the corpse of a lady in room 106 at roughly 12:30 p.m. It looked like she had been killed. When police arrived, they found a deceased lady resting on the floor next to the bed on her back. According to Iowa Cold Cases, she was wearing pajamas and lying in a pool of blood. The lady, eventually identified as Lee Rotatory, 32, had been stabbed to death inside her hotel room. On the other hand, authorities found no indication of forced entry or any fight in the room. Rotatory moved to Council Bluffs from Nunica, Michigan, in the weeks leading up to her death for a position at Edmondson Hospital, it as the new food service director. She intended to remain at the Best Western while attending her new job's training sessions and orientation. However, Gerald Stanley Jerry Namk, her husband, arranged for their mobile home to be transported from Michigan and for him to meet his wife in Council Bluffs. Lee Rotatori began her orientation at Edmondson Hospital on Monday, June 21st, co-workers on Thursday. Rotatori stopped for dinner at McDonald's at the end of her journey, which she carried back to her hotel room. According to Iowa Cold Cases, authorities suspect Rotatori was slain in the early morning hours of the next day. Dr. Samuel Rosa, the medical examiner for Pottawatomie County, found that Rotatori was murdered by a single knife wound entering her chest and puncturing her heart. Rosa told the Daily Nun-Parallel that the murder may have been motivated, but there was no definitive evidence to support that view. Unfortunately, little information pointed to a single suspect or person of interest. According to the Gazette, authorities first assumed the Best Western's position between Interstates 80 and 29 might hint at someone traveling through the region. However, they didn't rule out the possibility that it was someone from the area. Detectives also collaborated with Michigan State Police to see whether anyone connected to Rotatori's history was involved. Rotatori's spouse had a dark background and garnered unwanted attention during her murder, despite officials determining he had a valid alibi. As per Iowa Cold Cases, Jerry Nemke, Rotatori's second husband, was convicted of the 1960 murder of Marilyn Duncan. Jerry Nemke, who was 17, was first detained in connection with the killings of 3 women in Starved Rock, Illinois. Even though his involvement in the Starved Rock killings was never confirmed, Nemke confessed to Duncan's murder and was condemned to death. However, the Illinois Supreme Court eventually granted him a second trial. Nemke was found guilty and sentenced to 75 years in prison after his second trial. In August 1978, he married Lee Rotatori after serving only a fraction of a sentence. Several of Lee Rotatori's personal belongings, including her pocketbook and some jewelry, were reported stolen from her room at the time of the murder. On the other hand, authorities did not feel robbery was the motive. According to the Daily Non-Parallel, former police captain Alden Jones stated the hotel room was not dirty and nobody was hunting for something. According to the Daily Non-Parallel, authorities also investigated Rotatori's background, but according to all reports, she was well-liked in her neighborhood and never had any problems. According to Iowa Cold Cases, Michigan State Police Detective Richard Griffin stated that he did not talk to anyone who didn't like her. Despite their best efforts, authorities could not identify a person of interest or a suspect and leave Rotatori's death. In the case, the authorities unfortunately never got any helpful information. The case finally went cold and it remained unresolved for over 4 decades. Sources claimed in February 2022 that they had finally solved Rotatori's murder using evidence recovered from the crime site in 1982. Authorities sent over evidence acquired at Lee Rotatori's murder scene to a state crime lab in 2001 for additional examination. The lab used the evidence to generate a DNA profile and determined that it belonged to a man. Unfortunately, none of the DNA profiles in the local or national databases matched the DNA. Between 2001 and 2018, the profile was submitted to databases many times, but no matches were obtained. In 2018, however, Police Captain Todd Weddam examined matching the shape with genealogical DNA databases. DNA was finally sent to the Virginia-based business Parabon Nanolabs, which compared the DNA to profiles applied to a variety of genealogical websites. A college student called Eric Schubert, who specializes in genealogy DNA, became aware of the case and volunteered to assist in identifying the suspect's family using existing databases. Schubert could locate the suspect's great-grandparent, despite not finding a precise match. Authorities contacted numerous known great-grandparent descendants who agreed to DNA testing. The findings of these tests assisted investigators in narrowing down the suspect list to 2 brothers. They determined that Thomas O. Freeman, the eldest of the 2 brothers, was the most likely assailant. Using a DNA sample provided by Freeman's daughter, they could validate their findings. Authorities stated in February 2022 that Thomas O. Freeman, a truck driver in 1982, had killed Lee Rotatori. Detectives suspect Freeman committed the crime while traveling through Council Bluffs. Even though Rotatori's killer was ultimately identified, he will never face charges for her murder. Since Freeman was dead a few months after Rotatori was killed, Thomas O. Freeman's body was discovered in a shallow burial in a rural location outside of Cobden, Illinois, on October 30th, 1982. Investigators believe the guy was shot and buried 3 months before his corpse was discovered. The assassination of Freeman was never solved. Authorities believe that identifying him as Lee Rotatory's killer will also help them solve his case. They have cause to assume Freeman's assassination was connected to Rotatory's. Police Captain Todd Weddam told the Daily Non-Parallel that he is not a big believer in coincidences. According to him, Jerry Nemke, Rotatory's husband, was possibly implicated in Freeman's murder. According to Weddam, in the region where our suspect resided and died strengthened suspicions of his participation that he could have had anything to do with it. Even though Nemke is a person of interest in Freeman's murder, he died in 2019 and is no longer accessible for interrogation. Whoever did the murder seems to be no longer alive. Maybe that made this cold case get solved. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. This case is about Mandy's Tying Gasser. Mandy was a very outgoing and social person who loved spending time with her father outdoors. They would go on camping trips or just on road trips because she was a brave and adventurous girl who was not scared of anyone. One time she even saw a ground squirrel and held it in her arms to cuddle him. She was later bitten by that squirrel. It was not unusual for Mandy as she had a habit of petting snakes and other different animals she found along her camping trip. Her personality was very unpredictable, and she was often friends with dangerous people. Upon asking why she befriended such people, she would say that she does not judge her friends. In the fall of 1993, 17-year-old Mandy was a senior at the Tonawanda High School outside of Buffalo, New York. She was a brilliant student, but did not yet have any plans for her career, so she got into Niagara County Community College after graduation. She was a very energetic girl who loved partying and experimenting with alcohol. Sometimes she loved it so much that she often forgot to go back home. To protect her, her parents set up some rules for her to follow each evening she went out to drink. There was a specific time for her to return home, and if she would not follow it, she would have to call and inform her parents, or try to come home as soon as possible. On September 18, 1993, it was Saturday when Mandy was out with her friend Stacy, her boyfriend Brian, and Brian's friend Wayne. Stacy and Mandy had planned a sleepover at the Steingasser's house and were expected to return home by midnight. Stacy and Mandy were both 17, while Brian and Wayne were a few years older. Wayne had his apartment and they could easily buy liquor. That night, the group went to an alcohol store to buy whiskey and rum and later drove off in Wayne's car from North Tonawanda to Buffalo. They had planned to attend a rock concert in a bar, but the bouncer did not let the girls enter because of their age. Brian and Wayne decided to stay with them as both the girls were partially drunk. It was very unusual for Mandy to not call her parents to inform them about her whereabouts, even though she had missed her curfew time. A few moments had gone by when a car full of men pulled up near the group yelling at Brian and Wayne that they had harassed one of their neighbors. Soon, a fight broke out, which did not last long. But this scared both Mandy and Stacy, and they started running away in different directions. It was not long until the police sirens were heard and the man drove off. Brian and Wayne yelled at both the girls to come back, but Mandy was no longer seen. She had run away in fear that if the police found her, they would drive her back home, spoiling her plan to sneak into the house without letting her parents know that she had missed her curfew. Mandy started walking to her house, which was over a mile away. She walked north on Oliver Street until she reached a convenience store at the intersection of Fifth Avenue. A car pulled up next to her and she leaned into the passenger seat before getting into the car. It was an acquaintance from her school who offered to drive her back home between 1:10 and 1:30 a.m. on September 19th. This was the last time Mandy was seen alive. At 2:30 a.m., Mandy's mother Lorraine got a phone call from Stacy, asking whether she had returned home or not. This made Lorraine angry because she knew that her daughter had missed a curfew and did not come home. Her parents waited all night, but Mandy did not come. In the morning, they started calling all her friends. Mandy had a friend whose father was a policeman, so he came over to Steingasser's house. The investigation began, and the police said that she might have run away even though Mandy's parents did not believe it, because they knew their daughter well enough. Rumors spread that she might have gone south to Florida with her boyfriend, who had just moved there. On October 25, 1993, 5 weeks after the disappearance of Mandy, 2 men were hunting for mushrooms in the Bond Lane Park when they came across a set of badly decomposed human remains. The remains were sitting on the bank of Myers Lake, making it seem that someone had tried to push the body into the lake. It got stuck in the bushes. Later, those remains were identified to be Mandy's. The forensic report revealed that she was strangled to death by her bra and had 2 brain hemorrhages and a skull fracture near her front temple. The police became suspicious of this cool fellow with whom Mandy was last seen with. Even though the police publicly announced that they had a suspect, they did not reveal his identity, because they did not have any evidence to prove him guilty. The lack of proper evidence made this case grow cold until 25 years later, when new technology was available to test the culprit's DNA with the one found on Mandy's body. When the truth finally came out, on April 24, 2018, Joseph Belstad was arrested at his residence after he had returned home from work. It was his 43rd birthday, and he was charged with second-degree murder. Belstad stated that on September 19, 1993, he did give a lift to Mandy, but soon he dropped her off in front of a church and went to a donut shop before returning home. Witnesses revealed that they had seen Belstad picking up Mandy and never returning. His friends also said that Belstad had asked them to provide a false statement in his favor. Belstad denied all these allegations, but he was forced to take a lie detector test. The first time, he walked out of the room because he did not like the tone of the questioning, but the second time, his lies were confirmed and he was found to be a liar. Another witness came forward and said that Belstad had taken her to a remote place weeks before Mandy was murdered, which made his motives even more clear. On searching Belstad's car, investigators found 2 strands of pubic hair at the back seat of his vehicle, which they could not test in 1993. But after the latest technology in 2018, the hair was confirmed to be Mandy's. It was confirmed that Belstad had tried to sexually abuse her before getting angry at her and strangling her to death with her bra. His trial finally began, and the defense argued that he was being convicted without any proper evidence. But the jury came forward with many witnesses who told the court about Belstad's behavior after Mandy's disappearance. They said that he had stopped coming to school, to which Belstad said that he had a trip planned to Canada, which later got cancelled due to unforeseen circumstances. All these statements were found to be lies, and he was found guilty of murdering Mandy Steingasser. On January 14th, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison, even after he tried everything to maintain his facade. On the evening of August 4th, around 10:15 p.m., Helen Whitlock was cleaning up in her home near Humansville, Missouri. Helen was sure about the time because the television was on. The weather forecast called for storms the next day, but she didn't know that the storm would arrive sooner in her life than expected. Her husband, Frank, was outside tending to the cows. He was just moving his trucks when in the distance, he heard a girl laugh. Then about 15 minutes later, he heard gunshots. Frank finished his chores. Then he took his shotgun and got into his truck. He drove around his farm and saw a car parked in a hay field in a brushy area near his gate. When he saw the car, he thought it was just another group of partying teens, as the area was known for that. He continued driving, and after some time, he returned to that same spot. But by then, the car was gone. Franklin parked his truck back in the garage, thinking that it must have been a group of loud, noisy, and party-fanatic teenagers. He shrugged the thought of gunshots from his head and went on with his life. But it was just 6 days later. On August 10th, when their neighbors started complaining about a foul smell, Frank and Helen rushed to the same spot in the hay field where he had seen a car parked. And to their shock, they found a horrifying crime scene there. They found the badly decomposed bodies of 15-year-old Hazel Juanita Hanna and 16-year-old Cynthia Lorraine Bell on their farm. The girls' hands were tied up with a belt, partly undressed, and both were shot dead. Their bodies were found in dense underbrush near the Cedar-Polk County line. Hazel had been shot once and Cynthia had been shot twice. When the girls were found, they were not even identified. Among several personal artifacts belonging to the victims, police found a spent .25 caliber shell casing at the scene. The questions that lingered on Frank and Helen's mind was, who were these teenage girls? Why were their bodies buried in their farm? Was their murder related to that car which Frank spotted 6 days before? And could they have stopped such a horrific crime from taking place in their locality? To find answer to these questions, the authorities started digging into the background and backstories of Hazel and Cynthia. Cynthia was eventually identified by her dental records, and Hazel was identified by a relative who was willing to check the personal belongings. Hazel Juanita Hanna was born on February 24, 1961, and Cynthia Lorraine Bell was born on April 25, 1960. As apparently both of them led hard lives, both had the reputation to be difficult girls. They did not have a strong family life. Both were high school aged, but it was unclear if they had finished high school or not. And if asked about how did these two meet, it won't be wrong to say that both of them were runaways who were going in the same direction. Hazel was known for having a big mouth with smart remarks. According to the papers, she was pregnant and was planning to leave town. Cynthia was apparently the kind of girl to get into fights. She had told her friends that she was being abused. According to the papers, Cynthia too had gotten pregnant. She fled to Texas, where she gave birth to a child and gave the baby away before returning to the Humansville area. The girls were never in one spot for a long time. They were seen throughout the summer of 1976 in various cities, houses, and with various friends. If they had no place to go, they used vacant buildings or even sheds for shelter. But they did have a plan. The plan was to leave. The girls met a friend and he had plans to move to Joplin, Missouri to find work. Hazel and Cynthia were intending to tag along. However, the friend got scared that he might get in trouble for having 2 female teens with him, so he left alone. Hazel and Cynthia were so keen on leaving Humansville that they took a bus and tried to find him. When they failed, they hitchhiked back to Humansville. Authorities were told that the girls were picked up by a pair of truck drivers who gave them a hard time. Both girls got uncomfortable with them and asked to be dropped off. They were dropped off on an unknown piece of highway. To get to Humansville, they went back to hitchhiking. That's when a Polk County deputy officer saw them. He picked them up and took them to the county's juvenile office. This was on July 30th, 1976. That night, they were placed in foster care in a home in Morrisville. But they didn't stay there because that wasn't their plan. They left on July 31st, 1976. Their families reported them missing on August 1st, 1976. In the days that followed, they were seen hitchhiking, and somehow they did manage to get back to Humansville. Where did they stay? Nobody knew. They were last seen alive on August 4th around 9:30 p.m. The next time anyone saw the girls, they were murdered. A lead sheet in the case's investigative report file included notes on interviews and witness statements after the murders. But these tips came to a stop with the last lead sheet entry dating August 27, 1976. Then abruptly, the lead sheet starts again with new entries starting over a year later on September 27, 1977. It happened under the lead of the then Sheriff Simmons. New hope to solve this case came when the authorities spoke to a jail inmate who had just been arraigned for an unrelated 1977 murder. He said he knew who killed Hazel and Cynthia. Although the informant's name was withheld, Sheriff Simmons considered the man a reliable informant. The informant said that he was driving around with the man who committed these murders. They said they picked up Hazel and Cynthia on August 4, 1976. They drove down a gravel road to find a spot to hang out and make out. The inmates said that at one point, one of the girls became upset because one of the men got rough with her. She fled screaming from the car they were in and threatened to turn the 2 men in for rape. Then one of the men ran after the girl. He dragged her back while the other man got out a gun and they shot both girls. The men then drove to a spot to dump the bodies. At that spot, they shot the girls again to make sure they were dead. They then dragged the bodies into or underneath bushes and just left them there. The 2 men said they traded the gun at a pawn shop in Butler. Sheriff Simmons tried to find that gun. He drove over there and went into the pawn store. The store guy opened the drawer, pulled a pistol out of it, and handed it to Simmons. But Simmons found out that it was the wrong gun. The alleged murder weapon was long gone and was never recovered. Simmons believed that the pawn shop owner had been tipped off about the gun and he got rid of it. Simmons continued to believe the jail informant's story, however, but nothing came out of it. No more new leads came in, and the murder case of Hazel Winnie DeHanna and Cynthia Lorraine Bell remained cold and unsolved after decades of the crime. Even to this date, law enforcement have been trying hard to get some fresh leads on this case and track down the teen's killer, dead or alive. But there are some unaddressed questions in this case. Questions like, if Cynthia gave birth somewhere, are there records of the hospital or the resource center? If she gave up the baby for adoption, is there a paper trail available? If the authorities could track the baby's blood, they can subsequently track down the father, and maybe the father remembers something that can help police solve these murders. If you have any information on the case, you can contact the Polk County Sheriff's Office and also let us know in the comments below. The story begins when a sweet girl named Susan Cox Powell was born on October 16, 1981. She was born in Oregon and was known to be a very social, outgoing, and warm person. She used to be the center of attention wherever she went. She had a great bond with everyone and was very selfless. She used to never think twice before helping someone, as she was a very friendly and kindred spirit. Susan was married to her husband Josh Powell, who was born on January 26, 1976 in Oregon. Josh was not a very normal person, as he had a very tumultuous yet disturbing childhood. His father Stephen was very abusive and *****ing towards Josh when he was growing up. Josh had also been previously divorced before meeting Susan, and his court documents stated that he was emotionally suffering due to the abuse his father Stephen had made him go through. At one time, Josh tried to commit suicide but did not succeed. This was not the end of Josh's story. He even pulled out a ***** to kill his mom once because she asked him to do the dishes. Josh's mental condition was evidently not normal because of his father, who used to show him inappropriate stuff such as *****y at a very young age, which molded his personality into something unimaginable. Josh used to work as a web designer as well as in real estate. Susan and Josh were both devout Mormons and met each other at a church. Susan was only 19 years old when she met Josh. They both fell in love and soon got married. This shocked all of their family members, as it was a very abrupt and sudden decision. But Susan was sure that she and Josh were meant to be together forever. In April 2001, both Susan and Josh got married and lived a perfect happily married life for a few years. After a few years of living in Oregon, both Josh and Susan decided to move to Utah, specifically West Valley City. Later that year, January 19, 2005, they welcomed their first son Charlie into this world. 2 years later, they had their second son on January 2, 2007, named Braden. Charlie loved science, insects, and writing. He wanted to write a book one day, while Braden was an enthusiast when it came to trains, cars, and transformers. From the outside, they look like the perfect close-knit family, but sometimes things are not as they usually appear to be. Susan's childhood best friend Darlene was one of the first people Susan told that their marriage was not as perfect as it seems to be. She told her that Josh was very abusive towards her and was quite dominant when it came to their marriage. She said that Josh basically owned her, and every time she spoke about leaving, he would threaten her and says that the boys are his, and if she left, she would not be able to see their faces ever again. Darlene was confused if Susan knew all the stuff about Josh's childhood. Either she hid it pretty well or did not know about it all. In addition to their deteriorating relationship, they were also struggling financially, which added more to their miseries. In April 2007, Josh went bankrupt after buying a lot of stuff on Susan's credit, which Susan made a video of. She filmed all of her belongings and said that she is making this video in case something happens to her or her family. She also mentioned a few times that Josh broke some of her necklaces because he was angry at her and threw them onto her. This video was quite odd for the spectators, because they did not know what the actual purpose behind it was. Fast forward to December 6, 2009. It was a sunny morning when Susan and her two boys, who were 4 and 2 years old respectively, went to church. Later, a neighbor came to meet her at the house, and at 5 p.m., she left her house. The next day, December 7, 2007, Susan was supposed to drop her boys to the daycare, but surprisingly, she never showed up. The daycare called Josh's sister Jennifer, who claimed that Susan never came to meet her. Later, she went to their house and knocked at the door repeatedly, but nobody showed up. She got worried and suspected that something was wrong. She immediately called 911. When the police arrived, they decided to break into the house. After entering the house, all the police could find was Susan's purse and phone, but there was no sign of anyone there. This raised a lot of questions as to why Susan would leave without her purse and phone. Another thing that was odd was that 2 box fans were pointing towards the carpet as someone was trying to drive that. Josh claimed that he and his sons were out camping, and Susan was not with them when they left. He just returned from the camping trip and said that he did not leave until midnight the previous day, so he did not have any idea where Susan went. He said that he went to the Simpson Springs in West Utah. The police went there but found no evidence of any crime or something that would lead on to suspect Josh. This case soon became national news, and Josh at this point was only a person of interest and not a suspect, as no evidence was found against him nor any clue about where Susan could be. A month after Susan had gone missing, Josh decided to pack up all his belongings and move to Washington with his father, Stephen. This was a really strange thing to do, as it did not look like he cared about his missing wife, which put him under a radar. But he still maintained his innocence throughout. Few months have passed, and it is now the summer of 2010, with still no clue of Susan. Both the brothers Charlie and Braden were at a summer camp where Braden drew a very disturbing picture. He drew a picture of a minivan, himself and his brother. He also drew a picture of his father, but not his mother. Upon asking Braden and Charlie, both said that on the fateful night, both their mother and father were in the minivan. They both left the van, but only their father came back. At one point, Charlie also said that his mother was dead. All these speculations from the young boy still did not force the police to arrest Josh, as this had become national news now. People speculated that Josh was now definitely involved in the disappearance of his wife. When Josh felt that the heat was getting stronger on him each day, he brought in his father Stephen to claim his innocence. He made it seem like Susan was mentally unstable, and Josh also claimed that Susan might be cheating on him with a 30-year-old journalist named Stephen Coker. He also disappeared a few days after Susan went missing. The problem with this claim was there was clearly no connection between him and Susan being related in any manner. Furthermore, Stephen disappeared from Las Vegas, which is about 400 miles from where Susan lived. Amidst all this, Josh's dad said in an interview that Susan would bend over his lap to let him smell her hair or tell him to feel his thighs. All these new claims were coming from the father and son duo, which clearly looked like an attempt to direct attention from Susan's disappearance. Susan's friends and family said that all these claims were bizarre, as in reality, Susan was scared of her own father-in-law. Her family and friends claimed that Stephen would sometimes put his hand in the back of Susan's shirt, which freaked her out so much that, in order to get rid of him, she moved to Utah. The investigators suspected Stephen and decided to search his house. On searching his house, they found a bunch of inappropriate stuff, which included 3 computers and 2 boxes, which were filled with 4,500 photos of Susan that were taken without her knowing. The photos also consisted of close-ups of her body parts, which confirmed that Stephen was actually ing attracted to Susan. On September 22nd of the same year, Stephen was arrested for child pornography and for watching someone without their knowledge. After all of this, Josh's kids were taken away from him and were put into foster care. Meanwhile, Susan's parents immediately filed for their custody as they believed that Josh would harm the boys as they might know something about their mother suddenly disappearing. In September 2011, Susan's parents were finally granted custody of the 2 boys. The judge also advised Josh to move out of his dad's house if he wanted to see his kids. Josh ended up moving to Graham, Washington, and was only allowed to see his kids in a secured facility. After a few visits, Josh was allowed to do in-home visits, which was the biggest mistake anyone could make in this case. Elizabeth Hall was the caretaker that supervised the in-home visits between Josh and the two boys. She said that she and the boys became really close during their visits. On February 1st, 2012, Josh had a court date scheduled in order to get the custody of his boys. But on that proceeding, the judge presented new evidence, which was a really disturbing photo. The police discovered really disturbing and *****ing cartoons from Josh. As they were only cartoons, the police could not arrest him, but they ruled out Josh's permission to see his boys. Josh was overwhelmed, and as far as we believe, he started thinking of an evil plan at that point. After the proceedings, Josh went and withdrew $7,000 from his bank account, and then went and bought a lot of gas from the gas station and filled up gallons. After that, he went to a thrift store and donated all of his son's toys. On February 5th, 2012, it was the morning when the boys were going to see their dad. The caretakers said that it was all fine, and the boys seemed happy to be with their dad. Elizabeth Hall picked up the boys from their grandparents and drove to Josh's house. During this time, Josh's family members received a very disturbing email from Josh which said, "I am sorry. Goodbye." They also received a voicemail stating that Josh cannot live without his kids. Josh's sister got insanely worried and immediately called 911. She tried to call her brother, but he did not respond. Meanwhile, when Elizabeth Hall pulled up to his house, the boys jumped out of the car and ran towards the front door. Before Elizabeth could get in, Josh gave her a very weird look and slammed the door on her face before she could get in. She started screaming and banging on the door. While she was doing so, she heard Josh's voice telling Charlie that he had a surprise planned for him. Soon, the boy started crying and she saw that Josh was attacking his sons with a hatchet. Elizabeth also smelled gasoline. She called 911 and told them about the entire situation. Even after several minutes of trying to convince the police that the situation was serious, nobody came to help. The moment she turned around, the house was blown up in a huge fire and nobody survived. Josh not only killed himself, but also his two kids. After this incident, everybody was sure that Josh had done something to Susan. When Josh's father Stephen was asked about this, he did not seem to care. He was released from prison on July 11, 2017, and later passed away the following year in 2018. The official death cause of Josh and the two boys was carbon monoxide poisoning, and in August 2012, more information about Josh was revealed. Apparently, Josh had withdrawn his kids from daycare and canceled Susan's routine appointment with a chiropractor. He canceled her retirement account and also talked to a coworker about how to hide a body. Before Josh died, he named his friend Michael the sole beneficiary of his life insurance account. Police questioned his friend many times because they discovered that 2 years after Susan went missing, he got rid of his car in an abandoned junkyard in Oregon. Utah authorities stated that they believe Josh and Michael were both involved in the disappearance of Susan. However, on February 11, 2013, Michael took his own life. Soon after that, the investigation was closed, but shortly after, the police found an old handwritten note from Susan, which said, "If I died, it might not be an accident," which further clarified that Josh had killed his wife. But nobody was left to give the officials any more answers. This was altogether a very mind-boggling case, which could have been prevented through careful observation and responsible steps to prevent the death of those two innocent children. The most painful means of death is through burning. Before the flames burned her nerves, the pain would have been the most intense. Her burnt flesh would no longer hurt her after her nerves were seared. Who did this to Manjit Basra and her unborn? Why did it all happen? Was it this unborn child's fate to not meet the world? Let us look into this tragic incident that occurred in 2006. It was October in British Columbia's pure natural beauty. British Columbia was a paradise to live in with lush woods, flowing rivers, and towering peaks. Manjit Basra chose to live there. She was an Indo-Canadian woman and young mother who lived in a gorgeous suburb in British Columbia, Canada. Her father was Rasim Basra and her mother was Surinder Basra. Currently, Jasmine is married to Monty Bambra while working as a real estate professional in Canada. Manjit Basra was working as a school teacher. She appeared to have everything she wanted on the outside. A lovely house, a loving husband, a darling daughter Maya, a decent career, and the anticipation of having another child on the way. She was 4 months pregnant then, and it was her routine to attend yoga classes. Manjeet assumed that it would be a typical day for her. She planned to go to a prenatal yoga session in Surrey, British Columbia. But she never imagined that it would be the last day of her life. Her husband Muktir Pengali reported that Manjeet went missing after attending a prenatal yoga class. She had reportedly vanished on her way home, never to be seen or heard from again. Finally, after roughly 26 hours, Muktir Pengali reported to the police. Mr. Pengali informed that he thought he had to wait 24 hours for the police to accept his report, and so he was waiting for Manjeet at his home with his daughter. In a subsequent police press conference, he then begged the public to assist in finding his wife. If not for him, then at least for their 3-year-old daughter, Maya Kar Pengali. The girl at that age couldn't even understand what was happening around her. All little Maya could do was sob, thinking that her mother would come and stop her sobbing. But Maya didn't know that it wouldn't happen for the rest of her life. On October 23rd, shortly after 9 a.m., a body was discovered on a tiny strip of sand opposite the Delta Port Causeway. The victim seemed horribly burned and could not be recognized right away. Nonetheless, once the identification was completed, it was found to be none other than Manjeet herself. Mr. Pengali, his daughter, and their entire family were shocked by the news. Her family was lost and devastated. Her family believed that there was no evident connection between Manjeet's case and the remains discovered earlier. So her family stood in front of the media at about 2 p.m. on the same day and pleaded for information. Mr. Pengali screamed as he appeals to the public for help in finding his missing wife. He added that the body was not Manjeet's. However, besides all mourning and sadness, it was proved that the burnt body was in fact Manjeet. It was also found that the 4-month pregnant lady was strangled to death before being torched to destroy any trace or DNA evidence. Or so it was according to an autopsy report. Furthermore, it was determined that she had died before being placed near the harbor. It was dental data that helped to find her corpse on October 26th. The family is informed by Delta police who have taken over the inquiry. Days passed and there was no information left for her family. So little Maya, Mr. Pengali, and the Bastra family led a miserable life without Manjeet for the next few months. Then suddenly, on March 12, 2007, Delta police announced Mr. Pengali's arrest. The entire family stood stunned. Showed Mr. Pengali buying a lighter and a newspaper the night Manjeet went missing. But he told the investigating authorities he had been home with his daughter. Evidence shows that he had used his wife's cell phone after she was last seen alive, indicating that she had returned safely to the residence that they shared. But of course, Mukhtar's suspicious behavior in going out and getting drinks with his co-workers, even though his wife had not returned home the night before, and waiting 26 hours to file an official complaint didn't help either. Then there was Manjeet's diary, which turned out to be the primary evidence. She recounted their conflicts, marriage problems, despair, and belief that her husband had a severe drinking problem in the months leading up to her death. She even said she didn't want to bring another child into this turmoil. It says that it was like she was not allowed to stay happy by her husband even during her pregnancy. Even though the evidence was only circumstantial, Mukathar was charged with Manjeet's murder 5 months after she died. The evidence was just too obvious to ignore. He was the one who strangled his wife. He was the one who broke his 9 years of married life with Manjeet Pengali. He was the one who ruthlessly killed his unborn child along with the dreams of his wife and the future of his 3-year-old daughter. Mukathar Pengali might have even gotten away with murder. He hadn't used his wife's cell phone after murdering her or slipping out into the middle of the night to a nearby store and then lying about it afterwards. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced in 2011. During the sentencing, the court stressed the need to end domestic violence permanently. After all, he claimed Manjeet was murdered by her husband during a period when it was somehow acceptable to violate Indo-Canadian women's rights and prospects. Can you even imagine such a period of life where violating women's rights and prospects don't matter? But fate still wins. In February 2011, the British Columbia Supreme Court sentenced him to 15 years in jail without the possibility of parole. Crown Prosecutor Dennis Murray characterized the killing shortly after the trial. When his pregnant wife came home from a yoga class, Mukhtar arranged the finding of her car and Wally, burned her corpse on a lonely beach beside the Delta Port Bridge in South Delta, and then waited as long as he could before submitting a missing person complaint with the Surrey RCMP. The court revealed the letter and diaries of Manjit Pengali, showing everyone the prime evidence of the crime. I'm writing today because I never imagined letting myself get to this stage. I'm taking medicine for clinical depression.
I'm terrified.
My spouse does not provide the assistance I require. Manjit revealed in her writings that she kept herself high by drinking and using narcotics. She stated, "I'm broken, ruined, and crumbling, so I want to drink, use drugs, do whatever to make myself feel better." Manjit Pengali discussed her married life in one of her handwritten notes. She stated, "We need to improve on our relationship. We need to prepare ahead so that our relationship does not fall apart. This connection requires considerable attention. I need to keep in touch with him, make him adore me once more." She went on to say that her spouse Mukhtar Pengali has a drinking problem. She wrote, "I'm feeling helpless. I don't particularly appreciate living. Living in two cultures is quite difficult. He makes me feel helpless, hopeless, and terrified. I used to have no reservations about our lives together, my position in your life or our future, but now I'm terrified of what lies ahead." Manjit addressed several marital concerns in her letters to her husband. She stated, "We've suffered from various difficulties, including sex, drugs, alcohol, and our capacity to communicate, be affectionate, and love again. So I'm not sure if our relationship was enjoyable for you." On July 4th, 2006, Manjit celebrated her 31st birthday with her husband. In her diary on August 18th, 2006, she wrote that Mukhtar was pleased with the second pregnancy announcement. She wrote, "MP, even though he knew I was pregnant and on our anniversary, he sent me a gorgeous card. He was giddy and he was treating me like a princess because I was so happy I couldn't stop sobbing. After seeing the evidence, everyone thought, how could such a man turn into the murderer of his wife?" Mukhtar Pengali was sentenced to pay $614,300 to the claimants in the BC Supreme Court in domestic assistance and child care, loss of guidance, public guardian and fiduciary duties fees, interest, court, and other expenses. The rules of his unescorted absences that are his first leave will be for 24 hours, followed by a 48-hour UTA and then followed by 72-hour leaves. Pengali's parole form states, "You might not have had any direct or indirect contact with the victim's biological family members, including the victim's biological daughter, unless you obtain prior written approval from the parole supervisor. This is to avoid any additional victimization or unwanted contact." She says, "The judge said the murder pulled the victim's parents into a terrible whirlpool of grief, which she hopes will pass with time." The judge stated that the crime's motive is unknown. However, while in detention, the judge observed that Pengali participated in rehabilitation and had no recent criminal record or history of domestic abuse. She was conscientious about emphasizing the necessity of discouraging individuals in domestic violence instances and how fragile, and let's be honest, it's largely women, how vulnerable women are in a domestic relationship who trust their spouse. Manjit's death was one of 3 in the last several months that have raised concerns about domestic violence in Vancouver's Indo-Canadian community. Does it have to cost a life? She did not deserve to be a victim here. Was any of this her fault? People say that she suffered because she could not manage her husband's traditions and customs. But it's an individual's choice and right. At the end of the day, we don't have any authority to comment on it.